Hey guys, it's Miko from ML Sound Lab, and this is the Guitar Tone Dictionary. So when guitar players talk about their tone, they many times use words like boxy, or open, or dry. And throughout working in this industry for at least a dozen years, I've heard people use these terms and mean completely different things. That is why I think we need a guitar tone dictionary. So let's set the record straight on what these words actually mean. Okay, I'll quickly explain what I have going on here. I have a session where I just recorded a riff that I will be using for demonstrating this. I'm using Amped Blackout, which is our latest release. It was released this month, and it also set the release of our Black November deal. So for this month of November 2024, everything is 50% off in our store, just like Amped Blackout. So now is the time to get it, and you are actually running out of time. So be quick. That's the plug. Let's jump straight into it. So I have the settings set at noon here on the amp section, and the EQ is set noon, as you can see. And on the cabinet section, I'm using a V30 and a greenback with two dynamic microphones. Now this guitar tone is what I would call perfectly balanced, and that itself is one of those terms that is actually quite problematic because people use flat for describing dullness, while dullness is a matter of opinion. For example, a vintage guitar tone may seem dull for a modern guitar player. Likewise, flats can also describe a flat EQ curve, which is the same thing as a balanced FR flat response guitar tone, which in my books is a perfect guitar tone. This is what a balanced flat guitar tone sounds like. Now, many of these guitar tone terms actually fall into two major categories, one of them being bright, one of them being dark. Now let me demonstrate what brightness actually sounds like. So let's just pull up a high shelf EQ and boost the highs a little bit more on this guitar tone. So that is brightness. The opposite of that would be darkness, and I can demonstrate it easily here. Now that is the broad brightness and darkness description. However, when we go to brightness, we have other terms like thin. What is thin? Well, thin tends to describe a lack of bass or mids. So it's a little bit different, and I can actually demonstrate that by using a low cut filter. So thinness is something like this. So the guitar tone isn't necessarily brighter, but it doesn't have the lows and mids that you would actually like to have in the tone. So when you say something sounds thin, this is what people are talking about. Now many guitar players use the term smooth and harsh for describing the high end of the guitar tone. So that is a little bit more difficult to explain, but it has more to do with the exact mic up of the guitar cabinet. So we have a balanced guitar tone right now. I'll jump to the cabinet section here, and right now this mic up is a very smooth and rounded high end. So just have a listen to this. So you can even see the graph here where it's a very, very smooth, almost like an EQ curve on the high end. Now the opposite of that would be harsh. So let's try and get a harsh tone, even though I know it's gonna be very difficult because I've only put good impulse responses into this plugin. But let's pick, for example, the 421 on the Mix 77 and place it dead center. Let's see if we get a harsher tone. That is still a pleasant tone, but we are getting what I'm trying to explain here. Kind of a harsher frequency roll-off now, and that is, if you boost that, it will actually sound quite unpleasant. So that compared to the mic up that we actually had before. So now, even when I am boosting that nasty frequency area around 4K, it's not sounding that bad because the frequency roll-off is smooth. Now, one more term that guitar players love to use for brightness is airy. What does airy mean? I would say it has more to do with sort of a high shelf-like clarity, kind of an air frequency, so that is above presence, if you can imagine. So let's try and demonstrate that. So many times it's the same thing as Sizzle. So if this was a cleaner guitar tone, you would actually call that airy. But since it's a high gain guitar tone, it's Sizzle. Now, in the dark category of guitar tone terms, people love to use the word warm. And it's actually a little bit similar to the smoothness for the high-end terms, just approaching it from a different direction. So this is what warmth sounds like. The main focus there being that what you are mostly gonna be paying attention to in that guitar tone is the mids and the warm low end, not so much the excitement or sizzle in the high end. The word muddy is being used to describe overwhelming low mids. So if we just have a listen to this guitar tone and I'll boost around 250, you'll get a better understanding. Now, something to point out, this cabinet section in Blackout is a reflex cabinet section, meaning that it is an optimized impulse response where we don't actually have the problems people usually have around 250 Hz on guitar tones. So this doesn't actually sound as bad as it would if this was, for example, your average normal impulse response where you boost around 250. Now, what are guitar players talking about when they talk about a fat guitar tone? Well, it's similar to muddy, but it's in a more pleasant area. So fatness is much lower and doesn't actually sound that bad. So if you go lower to like 100 Hz or even below like 80, this is fatness. And when you go too far, you get what people call boomy. So if you go too low and too far with the boost, you get a boomy low end. Overemphasizing that is way too much, but that is essentially what people are talking about when they have a boomy guitar tone. You kind of have almost dynamic problems because the low end is booming Okay, then we have these guitar tone words that belong in a category of describing different kinds of balances. So for example, we have a focused guitar tone. What is a focused guitar tone? Get rid of the problematic low end, you get rid of the nasty sizzle, all you hear is the good stuff, the mid-range. So to demonstrate this, let me bypass this EQ so you'll hear the difference. So this is the focused guitar tone. And this is the balanced one. Now, I would say that with a balanced guitar tone like this, the sound is already quite focused. So what the focused guitar tone actually means is that you have the mid-range emphasis for the guitar tone and it will sit in the mix. Focused is kind of the opposite of scooped. And that brings us to scooped. So what is scooped? It's where you have a mid-frequency scoop in around 750 Hertz maybe. So let's go there. And that also shows us the next term, which would be nasal. So if you have too much of the 750 Hertz area, you have a nasal guitar tone. So let's go back here and boost around that same frequency. Another very common and difficult term that people use is Boxy. Now, what is a Boxy guitar tone? That is when you take the focused guitar tone a little bit too far. So if I put the low cut somewhere around 300 Hertz and then kind of do the same in the high end and put it around like 3K, and we only have like the mid-range, it gives you kind of this guitar tone almost as if you were hearing it through a telephone or something like that. So it sounds like this. So that is actually kind of a lo-fi effect, and these kinds of guitar tones are actually very cool in production. For example, if you have a guitar intro, you wanna on purpose have a super boxy guitar tone, and then when you hear the entire mix, it sounds so much better in contrast to that boxier, smaller sounding guitar tone. Now, the opposite of a boxy guitar tone is a fully open guitar tone. What does open guitar tone mean? It's the exact opposite of this. So you're not having any low or high roll off. You have a balanced guitar tone. If anything, you have some more emphasis in the sub lows and the overly bright frequencies. Now, another common way of describing balance is modern and vintage guitar tone. Once again, I would say a modern guitar tone is very similar to the scooped one that we just described. Maybe it's a little bit more subtle, but let's kind of demonstrate it again. So modern would be scooping. And vintage would actually be more like a little bit nasally, but not necessarily more of a white Q nasal sound. And a vintage guitar tone many times sounds a little bit nasal, like it did here, outside the mix, but in the mix it works so well, and you can have it quite low in volume because it will cut through the mid-range because there's nothing competing for that space. So for that reason, I actually tend to like a very good balance of both. I want to have a guitar tone like it is here balanced, where it's gonna be very difficult for you to say, is it modern or vintage, or is it both? So that is what balanced means. It's not modern, it's not vintage, it's taking advantage of having both of those characters in there. Now these were guitar tone terms that were actually easily explainable with EQ. However, why would we stop here? We are guitar players. Let's come up with some new terms that are even more complex. So for describing dynamics, us guitar players, we love to use punchy, which is the same thing as dynamic. And what that means is not a lot of compression, or not any compression essentially, because when you drive the gain you actually tend to get rid of dynamic. So for guitar tones, dynamic usually means no compression at all. Now the opposite for that would be compressed, and this is actually something that is many times used in the wrong way when describing guitar tones, but it works. Most of the time when people are talking about an overly compressed guitar tone, it's actually more to do with the saturation of the guitar tone. When you have too much gain, you start to get compression where all the clamps that you're doing are really popping out of the mix. That just means that you have too much gain. Now, if we are talking about a clean guitar tone and use the term correctly, we're talking about a compressed guitar tone. Us guitarists love to use a compressor on our clean tones to get the volume balance more even and once again be heard better. Now, us guitar players, we love to use the terms tight and loose. This mostly describes the dynamics in the low end of the guitar tone. So if we're talking about a tight guitar tone, we're talking about something like a Mesa Boogie Mark IV, or if we're talking about the loose guitar tone, most likely we're talking about something like a rectifier, where even if you palm mute, you're not going to get a tight sound. To demonstrate this, I'm actually going to put this EQ before the amplifier, and if I now use a low cut filter, I can make this guitar tone extremely tight. So just have a listen to this. And the opposite of that would be loose. Let's use an EQ and boost these problematic low end area here, like this. And here you'll see that sometimes that can actually be a good thing. We sort of got like a fuzz tone with boosting the problematic lows of the DI signal. So this is pre-EQ once again. So looseness, fuzz, tightness, tube screamer, you get the point. Then we get to the effects terminology, mainly just talking about wet or dry. Now, I see people use the word dry to describe all sorts of things. Brightness, the amount of gain. Let's set the record straight. Dry has nothing to do with your brightness or gain. Dry is the opposite of wet, and this is all about the time-based effects. So if your guitar tone is wet, it has a lot of reverb or delay on it. If it's dry, it doesn't have any reverb or delay on it. And dry is the same thing as raw. So there you go. Stop using the word dry in the wrong way. Those are the most important terms for guitar tone knowledge. That is the main dictionary. Now, don't think that us guitar players would stop there. That is not enough. So let's go through some more complex terms. Throaty, which is like a guitar tone that sounds like this. Woody, it's a guitar tone that sounds almost like an acoustic guitar. Twangy describes the country guitar tone. So most of the time a Telecaster with kind of a high mid-range boost, heavily compressed. So that is the twang sound. Then we have chimey, glassy, or sparkly. All means the same thing. Kind of similar to the twangy sound, but higher in the frequency area, so more like an AC30 tone essentially. Okay, and that's it. If I left something out, please comment down below and I'll do my best to try and explain it. I've been Mikko from ML Sound Lab, and like I said, we have our Black November deals out right now, 50% off for the rest of this month, so you are actually running out of time. Go get them now. Everything in our store is 50% off. I've been Mikko from ML Sound Lab. See you on the next one and subscribe. Bye bye.